It's wonderful to be here both with Andy Nathan and with Nirupama Rao, who's written an amazingly interesting book, The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China, 1949 to 1962. And I think what was, for me, so interesting about it was that it's a long book, but filled with some wonderful research that she's done, from letters, government documents, one thing or another, that really gives us a early version of an attempt to find some common chord with China when China first became the People's Republic of China in 1949, and then describes what happened. And the thing that struck me about reading it was that it is a lesson, we were just talking about this, that I think many, many countries have learned since, but not from each other, and not from history, but from their own sort of rather bitter experience. And Andy Nathan, who, as I think many of you know, teaches at Columbia, political science, many things with great interest in human rights questions and foreign policy questions. Nirupama Rao, you will know, has been ambassador to Sri Lanka, the United States, China, and then ended up as foreign minister.
Foreign secretary.
As foreign secretary, excuse me. And then spent 8 years writing this book, which I do recommend. You might think that back in 1962 would have not much to say about today, but I think it has everything to say about today. Okay, Andy. You start us off.
Don't you want to ask Ambassador Rao to say?
Why don't you? Good idea. So tell us, Andy, you had the question first.
I have a bunch of questions, but
okay.
you know what they're going to be, so you can answer them without me asking.
So what did you learn from this book?
Well, first of all, thank you, Orville, thank you, Andy, and thank you to the Asia Society for making this event possible today to discuss my book. You asked me, you mentioned 60 years since 1962, since we fought this brief, bitter war between India and China. And as the saying goes, the more things change, the more they are the same. 2 years ago, up in the high mountain fastnesses of Ladakh, it's one of the toughest geographies in the world. You can well imagine troops facing each other at about 16 to 17,000 feet above sea level. It's most inhospitable terrain. And we had a brief, well, not a war, but one night in June, troops of the two sides clashed in what is called the Galwan Valley in eastern Ladakh. Ladakh, as you know, is now a union territory. It used to be part of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But in 2019, as you know, Article 370 of the Indian Constitution was held in suspension, you may say revoked, and there was a kind of reorganization of the state of Jammu and Kashmir and its division, as it were, into two union territories. So you have the union territory of Jammu and Kashmir and you have the union territory of Ladakh. And Ladakh today is a huge expanse of territory. If you look at it on the Indian maps, it stretches from, well, let's say from the eastern side of this hammer-headed line you see on the maps of India up until the border with Afghanistan. Now that is the border as claimed by India. As you know, a part of Kashmir is held by Pakistan and a part of Ladakh is held by China. So in a sense, this whole territory of Jammu and Kashmir, which included Ladakh, has been kind of, in a sense, it exists in a state of trifurcated suspension, as it were. And in Ladakh, 2 years ago, as I said, we lost 20 soldiers in a very bloody primeval clash with the Chinese. No weapons were used. It was just sticks and stones, literally. A most barbaric struggle which left 20 of our soldiers dead And according to Chinese figures, 4 Chinese killed too. We really don't know what the Chinese figures are because transparency is not their middle name, as you know. But be that as it may, why I mention Galwan is that today in contemporary geopolitics, in the relationship between India and China, many of the same problems that arose and which led to the war in 1962 continue to exist, and in a sense are magnified many times over by the fact that, as you know, China today is risen, it's powerful, it's wealthy. From the other side of the fence, it looks assertive, it looks aggressive, and it is determined, to put at rest what Xi Jinping calls the century of humiliation. And that has translated into a lot of these border claims, these unsettled border claims, and we have the longest unsettled land border problem in the world between India and China. And across that border, which, as I mentioned, is mountainous, there are various pockets where there is the way the two countries are interpreting up to which line they can patrol is different from the perception on the other side. And that has led to clashes of this nature. So in many senses, despite the efforts that we made, the United States made vis-a-vis China, the efforts India made vis-a-vis China, in a sense to bring it into the circle of nations that talk to each other, that try to settle these problems through negotiation and to build relationships in that process, that in many ways I think has come aground, both for the United States and for India. And in that sense, my book, I feel, the story I write and the time it took to research it, is worthwhile, not only for young Indians, and back home I think we need to educate minds and people about the nature of the conflict, but also across the world to understand that here we were, a young democracy, India, newly independent, trying to bring China into the world, literally, trying to make it a member of the Committee of Nations, the kind of experience we had, the humiliations we suffered, and the miscalculations we made, because yes, mistakes and miscalculations are very much a part of this story, and hence I wrote this book.
So that's what I wanted to ask about, because having a book from a professional diplomat is very different from having one from a political scientist. And that's what I think is so one of the things so interesting about this book, because I read the book, although Ambassador Rao is very nice, a nice person and soft-spoken individual, I read it as a very severe criticism of Jawaharlal Nehru, the heroic, first prime minister of independent India. So Nehru, when he came to office, when India became independent, inherited from the British vis-a-vis this border that she's talking about two things. One was that the British claimed that Tibet was autonomous, although it was under something called the suzerainty of China, a sort of medieval concept, very mystical. And in fact, the British had negotiated independently with the Tibetan authorities, and among other things had agreed on a borderline. The British delegate was McMahon. I forget what his job.
Henry McMahon. He was the foreign secretary
of India
at that time.
The foreign secretary of colonial India negotiated with the Tibetan authorities and drew this line called the McMahon line. So Nehru comes in and he's like, this is cool. Tibet is autonomous under sovereignty, and we have this boundary, and that's fine, and it's the status quo, and there's no reason for the Chinese communists to have anything to worry about, plus the fact that we're friendly to them, and we treat them really well, and I forget what in the UN that Nehru did for the Chinese, advocated that they
be permanent members of the Security Council.
They be admitted to take the China seat, and so Nehru's attitude was, and Zhou Enlai, of course, charmed Nehru. So Nehru's attitude was, this is great, Tibet is, autonomous, our traditional privileges there and our relations, trade and religion, and the border, everything is fine because I've been nice to Zhou Enlai. Well, this was foolish because from the Chinese point of view, that all of that was this illegal British imperialist, not to be accepted. And Nehru took so long to wake up to it, partly because he had an ambassador in Beijing at first, right, Panikkar?
Yes.
Who was, the Chinese are very nice people, they have an ancient civilization.
Well, he'd also been ambassador for the nationalists, hadn't he?
That's right.
That's true, that's true. He had been ambassador to Nanjing, and then. So I read, this is a thick book, but in many places, there are these places where she says Nehru was poorly advised, or Nehru was, didn't want to touch these issues and believed that the Chinese would never touch them, and so forth. And I read it as a very sharp, although politely phrased, criticism of somebody who, was a dreamer about the nature not only of China, but of really about territorial issues. And he thought, if we don't touch it, it'll never arise, which is crazy in international politics. I'm using harsh language to try to get you to see whether you would agree with that
Well,
reading.
I think what I've tried to say is that there was a sharp dissonance between Nehru's frontier policy and Nehru's foreign policy. And when it came to foreign policy, he wanted to somehow bring China into the fold. He felt here we were, India and China, two newly independent or liberated nations, whatever adjective you use, that we needed to create together through our cultivation, let's say, of mutual trust, a kind of third force in geopolitics, in international affairs. Because if you remember, this was the time of the Cold War, and it was East versus West, and Nehru always felt, and maybe he was right, he was not entirely wrong all the time, that he felt that the communist Chinese were a class apart. They were not made in the mold of the Soviet Union. They were not exactly your classic Marxists from, wherever. He felt that the Chinese would be Chinese above all, and that China, as a risen nation, our neighbor, our next-door neighbor, was a country with which India had to cultivate understanding, because peace in Asia, even if that seems a very idealistic, romanticized concept, peace in Asia could only be achieved if these two large nations, those days they called it a friendship of 900 million. That was the size of our populations together. Today, of course, it's multiplied manifold. So that was the attitude as far as foreign policy went. But as far as frontier policy went, Nehru basically proceeded on the lines that we assumed that were there because the British and the Tibetans had agreed upon the McMahon line, as Andrew just mentioned. And also, as far as Ladakh was concerned, he said, let us adopt the forward lines that the British drew on their maps. Even the British, as far as Ladakh was concerned, you see that the India-China border has a western sector, it has a middle sector, and it has an eastern sector. And the eastern sector, which borders Burma, Myanmar, is where the McMahon line runs. But in the rest of all the sectors of the border, there is no McMahon line. There is a line that we have assumed would follow the highest crest of the Himalayan watershed, where the Tibetan plateau ends and where the Himalayas begin. And we drew our boundary, our frontier along that high crest. And in Ladakh, as some of you are aware, it's an arid wasteland. It is essentially an extension of the Tibetan plateau, Ladakh. It is not just the high Himalayas. You have the Himalayas, you have the Karakoram mountains, but you have high altitude moonscape, literally, very much like Tibet. Very difficult to draw lines there, very difficult to really pitch a frontier line in that kind of territory. But be that as it may, when Nehru came to agreement with China in 1954 on Tibet, where we essentially conceded that Tibet was a part of China. Until then, these concepts of suzerainty and then replaced by sovereignty, that debate had continued. But India essentially conceded that Tibet was a part of China and gave up all the, you may argue, these were imperial rights and privileges that we enjoyed, courtesy of the British Raj in Tibet. We gave up all that. And we established a consulate general in Lhasa, where earlier we had a political officer in Lhasa. We didn't have a consulate. We established a consulate. We began to do border trade with Tibet. And Nehru assumed that with this agreement, the Chinese had essentially recognized India's frontiers with Tibet. Because if you remember, India had conceded Tibet status to China. But without, and that is a lesson for all of us practitioners and perhaps students of international affairs to learn from this, that never leave anything to guesswork in negotiations. And he assumed that the Chinese, by not raising the issue of the frontier during those discussions, had essentially conceded where the frontier should lie with India, which was not the case. The Chinese had deliberately not raised the issue because they felt internally that they needed more time to study the issue, and they were not going to raise it at that time, but by no means had they given us any guarantee that the boundary was settled. But that's where I think the fatal flaw of Nehru's decision-making comes to the fore, because a few months after that, while he's holidaying somewhere in the Himalayas, he decides to issue these orders saying that forthwith the boundaries, our boundaries with China, will be shown as fixed and determined. When they were not fixed and determined, unfortunately, that was not the case. And that's where, from that point, I think everything begins to unravel. And we're still dealing with that terrible entanglement, literally.
I want to get a little bit in the weeds. You say in 54, India recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. My understanding is that the Chinese did not consider India to have fully recognized that until there was a summit with Rajiv and somebody else. What was missing in 54 that had yet to be settled later?
Yeah, I'm talking of, Andrew, I'm talking of this substantive recognition that the Tibet, the case of Tibet, could no longer be considered from the other point of view, where you would assume, as perhaps many do today, that Tibet's status was never really determined through history. That Tibet had existed in this kind of a limbo, literally. Was it a nation? Was it a country? Or was it was China the suzerain? Or was it a part of China's territory? I mean, these debates went on incessantly, but the British took advantage of the fact that China was weak and divided, especially after the fall of the Qing dynasty, and there was a civil war, and then the Japanese invaded. And China could do very little in Tibet. It was not a presence in Tibet from 1911 to 1950, literally. There was really virtually no Chinese presence in Tibet. And the British Raj had, in that period, set up these agencies and set up this political office in Lhasa, and it was dealing with the Tibetans one-on-one, without any Chinese interlocutors. So India inherited that state of affairs, and when the Chinese invaded Tibet, when the Chinese began their occupation of Tibet, some may quarrel with my use of these words, but the Chinese came into Tibet. The Chinese People's Liberation Army entered Tibet in the autumn of 1950, and by May of 1951, when they signed the 18-point agreement with the Tibetans, literally, the Dalai Lama had to sign on the dotted line, it was all over. And in this brief interregnum, Tibet tried to go to the United Nations, tried to seek international support, and didn't get it from India, didn't get it from the UK, and didn't get it from the United States. And essentially the cause was lost. The Tibetan cause was lost at that time. So from 1951, China has exercised quote-unquote sovereignty over Tibet. In 1954, what India did was to recognize, and that's the title of the agreement if you read it, the agreement on trade and intercourse between the Tibet region of China and India. The Tibet region of China. I mean, that says it all. I think it speaks volumes. So that's what I mean.
That's what you mean, but yet the Chinese wanted more than that. They wanted India to recognize that Tibet had always been and would forever be part of China. Its status could not change and so on. They wanted more.
I think after the revolt in Tibet, the rebellion in Tibet, the Khampa rebellion from the mid-50s in Tibet, and the events in Lhasa, and the flight of the Dalai Lama to India in March 1959, that came at a point when relations between India and China had already started to unravel. The so-called friendship of 900 million had been exposed for what it was, absolutely hollow. And trouble had begun in Ladakh. Indian and Chinese troops had begun to clash with each other. The Chinese had built a highway through Ladakh, through territory that we claimed as ours, which was how, the genesis of the dispute lies in that. And then you had the rebellion in Tibet, and the Dalai Lama, who is, the symbol of the unity of the Tibetan people and their identity in many ways, had come into India. I mean, that was quite a body blow to the Chinese. And you had the Soviets also criticizing the Chinese. If you look at the Soviet records, accusing Mao of having mishandled the Tibetan issue and being solely responsible for things going wrong, and that there was no point blaming the Indians. The Chinese began to blame the Indians at that time, saying that they had kind of had a hand in all this with the help of the CIA. And so that kind of, bad blood, if you can call it, had already crept into the relationship at that time. So when Rajiv Gandhi went to China in 1988, I was there, present at that visit. The thrust or the emphasis from the Chinese was to somehow get from us an assurance that we were not supportive of anti-Chinese activities on our soil by Tibetan refugees against China. And that is why in the joint communique or statement issued after that visit, there is this reference saying India sees Tibet as an autonomous region of China and does not support anti-China political activities on its soil. That was the reference.
Should I ask one more? I'll just
You're
ask
on a
one
roll,
more.
Andy. Go ahead.
No, but so then what would you have done or would you have had Nehru do instead in this period of time?
Yeah, hindsight is always, everybody sees 2020 with hindsight. But I think you have to situate this whole story in the context in which it happened. And so that's why I wrote the book. It's like a set of moving pictures in many ways. India, a young country, consolidating nationhood, so facing enormous challenges. And Nehru was not just looking at the map of India's border with China. He had many other things, to deal with, and huge problems to handle. You were dealing with a country that had been colonized for close to 300 years, impoverished. Look back at 1820 when China and India had the leading GDPs in the world, and what we were reduced to in 1947 when we were independent. The entire unification in many ways of bringing the princely states and the rest of India together, what Sardar Patel did. And Sardar Patel and Nehru worked together, regardless of the reports you may hear from time to time now. They essentially worked together. They were a team that understood each other, even if they may have been rivals on other counts. But Nehru and Patel worked together to consolidate this, but there were enormous problems. You had to create an industrial structure in India. You had to deal with the issue of food security. You had to deal with the abysmal poverty of the people. And in all this, you also have to deal with Pakistan. You had a very problematic relationship from inception with Pakistan, and then with China, this long border of over 2,000 miles in the most, as I said, difficult geography in the world. So Nehru was dealing with all this. And how could he have dealt with it differently? Well, if I had been ambassador to China at that time, I would have advised him to raise the question of the frontier with the Chinese, because this whole status of Tibet and its independence or its being part of China rested, or the question of the McMahon line rested on this, whether Tibet had the right to sign agreements independently, because it signed this independently with the British. The Chinese were not party to this Indo-Tibetan agreement which finalized the McMahon line. They were party to the larger conference which was taking place. This was a conference within a conference, the McMahon Line Agreement. But there was a larger conference, a tripartite conference, which was looking at the status of inner and outer Tibet vis-a-vis China, where Chinese control could be exercised and which part of Tibet would be relatively autonomous, relatively independent. So that was the whole question in that Simla conference, where McMahon was the British plenipotentiary, but you had the Chinese plenipotentiary and you had the Tibetan, the representative of the 13th Dalai Lama, Longchen Shatra, who was there. So this was the play within the play, literally, what happened with the McMahon line. But it was tied to the status of Tibet. Could Tibet have signed such an agreement? The Chinese argued that they were in no position to do that they were not sovereign, so therefore the agreement is illegal. We say, having inherited this from the British, this line, it obviously worked to our advantage, and we said that Tibet did have the right. You have to look at what happened. The Chinese were not party to it, but the fact is that China, having now occupied or come into Tibet and become, the power there, should respect these agreements, should concede that these agreements had to be made, and the border between India and China should be settled on that basis. But from the beginning, China has disputed that line because it rests on the assumption that Tibet had the right to sign such an agreement.
So
and therefore, I would have said, since this problem exists, I would have briefed Nehru in entirety.
Okay, so you opened negotiations with China.
Yes. And
they actually wanted a lot of the territory that India, it wasn't just that the McMahon line was illegitimate, but that there were big territories they wanted. So then would you have
still want.
And still want. Yeah, so would you have given those away?
No, but let me come also to, there's the other side of the story. Now, China is equally in the process of, bringing its act together in a way, because after the Civil War, the communist regime having been established, those first few years of China's existence, let's say until the Great Leap Forward, it's a time also of consolidation and of understanding the lay of the land, literally knowing where the problems lie. And this relationship with India had not kind of become set the way it is today. And I think leaders like Zhou Enlai, although he was a very shrewd man, and I think he understood geopolitics very well. But I think at that stage, when they were still consolidating their presence in Tibet, they were, it was a difficult time for the Chinese when they came into Tibet. No roads, no infrastructure. They had very little knowledge of the history of the place. It was a process of learning, a process of education. I think at that period, they may have been prepared to accept certain, what you call a status quo. Like in south of the McMahon line, what we call the state of Arunachal Pradesh today, India had already established its presence by 1951. The same time the Chinese were walking into Tibet, 1950, 1951, we had begun to consolidate our presence right up to what we call the frontier with China in the east, south of the McMahon line. So the town of Tawang, which is the site of the biggest Buddhist monastery in India today, it's the Gelugpa, Yellow Hat sect monastery, very important for the Dalai Lamas and even for Tibetan Buddhism. We had already established our presence there, so we had already come up to that frontier. So the question of us retreating from that, Nehru was already saying at that time, this is our frontier, map or no map. Famously, he said that. So there was no question of us withdrawing from there. So I think the Chinese, at that point of time, were, in my view, open to the prospect of settling on a frontier that would have essentially recognized India's presence in those areas. Except that in Ladakh, and that's thereby, as Shakespeare would say, there lies the rub. The fact is, in Ladakh, we drew a frontier line. Nehru said, this is the frontier, map or no map. But we hadn't exercised occupation. We hadn't exercised our administrative presence for the one main reason being it's such inhospitable terrain. It's not like the eastern part of the border where you have forests, you have monasteries, you have people settlements, you have water. Ladakh is a moonscape, very little water, inhospitable terrain. You had trade caravans and trade routes going through the area. But we didn't have people, settled populations, a village here or there, a hamlet here or there. But in the Aksai Chin, which translates into the desert of white stones, there was no population, literally. And the Chinese built a road there. And we claimed it as ours. And that's how the dispute began. India said, this is our territory, you've built a road, you came in without visas. Sounds ridiculous to say that today. I mean, they just walked in, they built a road there. And we expected them to shut things down, withdraw, and concede that this was Indian territory. So we proceeded on the assumption that every part of this territory shown on our maps is obviously ours. There's no question of a dispute. It's the Chinese who have made the mistakes, and they should withdraw. So that's how the dispute began. And I think at that point of time, we could, perhaps Nehru being, I think, in some ways a realist. I mean, he's often said to be an idealist, a romantic, a visionary. In my book, I talk of Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog and the fox, and that Nehru is more like, I think, the fox. He knows many things, but he's not an expert in any one. So that, I think, was his failing. And he didn't really read the signals sufficiently accurately enough. And I think that's where we, as advisors, assuming that I'm a fly on the wall watching things happen. This is what he needed to have been told. So everybody assumed that he was their Caesar, that we just follow his line.
Well, I mean, there's the question of which you've been probing, Andy, the failure of Nehru to maybe see realistically what he was up against. But there's also the question of Chinese intentions. And I want to read a quote from your book and just then to ask you a question. This is from Girja Shankar Bajpai, who was Secretary General, Ministry of External Affairs in 1950. So here's what he says, and I wonder what Nehru made of it or what the rest of you made of it or how it rings to you today. He says, my own rather cynical view is that in us, China sees the only potential rival to political and economic equality in Asia and, therefore, jealously rather than love is likely to be the real sentiment of China towards us. While we should do our best to cultivate her friendship, we must not be led away by false sentiment or illusion. Well, it seems to me, and this is the question I want to put to you, that we've had, and I intimated this in my opening remarks, we've had many forms of this illusion possessing many countries at many different times in history in serial fashion, and they've all had pretty much the same ending with some exceptions. They figured out the boundaries with Pakistan and whatnot. But do you think that there is something innately about the way China approaches the world and its Leninist sort of view of things that made all of these efforts? This was your first effort. You were the first engagers.
Yes.
And you had a miserable failure. I mean, do you think all subsequent efforts at engagement were folly?
Well, there's no question in my mind that China cannot be isolated completely from the rest of the world, even more so today when the levels of engagement or entanglement, as some people call it, are so intense and so complex and so developed. I think what one needs to, the lesson that we could learn from the story I wrote was that for everything there is a time and a season, I think. And in this case, India had the opportunity, I feel, to settle or to at least come to some understanding, or perhaps if you look through the glass darkly, perhaps to understand the Chinese in a better way than we did.
How would that be?
If we had kind of laid open the whole thing and said we have to discuss these problems, we do not have a settled frontier, we must come to some understanding, because between countries such as ours, an unsettled frontier is bound to cause problems in the future. So, at the core of the dispute between India and China, perhaps less than, it's different between the US and China, at the core of the dispute between India and China, and I'm looking at it the way many Indians do today, is the border dispute. It is at the core of the relationship.
Do you think that's really what's going on, though? That it's a question of boundary lines of a pile of rocks in the middle of the dock? Or is there something else at work?
For both countries, I think the issues of sovereignty are very, very important. Yeah. I think these are problems left over from history, I think, as the Chinese like to say very famously. They've been these are legacy disputes today. In the 21st century for India, this is a legacy dispute. But can we kind of brush it aside and say, yes, this is not going to be resolved, we can develop relations in all other areas, which we tried to do for the last 3.5 decades, we did. But you just saw how weak that foundation was when you had that one bloody clash in Galwan 2 years ago. Everything collapsed like a house of cards. So that brings me back to my logic is to assume that this question of the boundary has kind of embedded itself, particularly in the psychology of many Indians. It's the question of, and then you have the China-Pakistan relationship today. Everything is tied to that land frontier of ours. You may argue that in the Indo-Pacific and where India is very well positioned, I think, to play a significant, almost pivotal role when it comes to the Indian Ocean, given our natural assets geographically, given where we are situated in the region. Despite all that, I think it's this question of the fronts, the land frontier that is so unsettled and so unstable and so potentially kinetic, both vis-a-vis Pakistan and China today.
So if India and China could be fighting over some really essentially irrelevant sovereign territory in Ladakh, what are they going to do? What's India going to do when China presses its claim in the east, in the area along the Burmese border, which is vast, fertile, Arunachal Pradesh? What's going to happen? That could be a major kind of clash.
Absolutely, and I think the situation I speak of in my book had already begun to change, not just because of the war, but by the mid-1980s, the Chinese had already in negotiations with India. We were having border talks, as you know, for many years after we kind of tried to normalize relations from 1976 onwards. From the early 80s, we were talking about the border, and by the mid-80s, the Chinese had brought up this issue, saying that the eastern sector of the border, the area you refer to, is the sector of the largest dispute.
And it's huge.
And it is huge. 90,000 square kilometers of territory, in the east that is disputed. So they said that you have to indicate how you plan to settle this part of the border, after which we'll tell you what we can suggest as far as the western part of the border is concerned, where China is in occupation.
So they've linked.
They've linked the two. And the situation has stayed like that for the last almost 40 years. It hasn't changed. The Chinese continue to highlight their view that the eastern sector is the area of largest dispute and that India must provide some formula for a settlement there before it has to come as a package.
What we have learned with the Taiwan case, that a status quo is very fragile.
It is.
And that when China gets sufficient means and military force and positions itself well enough in the world, it will probably turn that eastern section of India into something comparable to Taiwan. Would you not think?
I mean, you see, I don't know if the Chinese will trigger another conflict with China, especially in the eastern part of the border. Today, what has happened in Ladakh, there are two sets of assumptions here. You have a border line, which is disputed between the two countries. In the eastern sector, it's far south to where India draws its borderline. Therefore, you have this huge chunk of territory claimed by China. And in Ladakh, you have a big expanse of territory between India's claim line and China's claim line. But today, it's not so much a question of where the border lies. It's a question of what is famously called the line of actual control. Up to what line does each country exercise control, actual control? In Ladakh, in the eastern part of the border, things have been relatively quiet, thank God. It hasn't sort of become unstable the way things are in Ladakh today. And it's this line of actual control that the two countries have not been able to mutually define. The Chinese have refused to define it. The Indians had offered to begin an exercise, and indeed the two countries had begun an exercise, but which kind of did not proceed after one or two rounds of discussion. So it stayed like that, and as India has tried to improve its infrastructure along our side of the line of actual control, and our roads have come closer, and our reach is much more visible in that area. And the Chinese have also expanded their infrastructure facilities, and patrols have crossed each other's lines of perception of where the actual control line lies. You've had clashes like this. Is what is happening today on that contested frontier.
Can I ask, what is China's claim? Is it based upon what they allege is the historical extent of Tibet?
It's like the South China Sea.
Yeah. Or what?
I don't believe that China's claim in the East, particularly in the East, is based on any historical record. Traditionally, the Tibetans and the Himalayan peoples, as you know, it was a kind of a borderland where people crossed over for pilgrimage, for trade, as you know. In some parts of the Himalayas, there's a line called the bamboo line and the pine line, and the Tibetans would tend to come into areas which were mountainous and which were temperate in climate, and would not really go into areas which were closer to the plains. So China has tried to translate, and in a very illogical and a way that's difficult to understand, these kinds of traditional cross-border activities into sovereign claims, so-called sovereign claims, and that's what has happened.
Let me ask you both a question. I mean, we've talked a lot about lines, and it's bewildering, I'm sure, for all of you, and certainly for the world that doesn't know something about this contentious question. But what do you think is really going on here? Andy, let's start with you. I mean,
what's really going on?
Yeah, I mean, what does China really want?
It's all an illusion.
I mean, let's just say India gave away a lot of territory. Would that end it?
No, I don't think. I mean, you can start.
You go ahead. No, please. I want to find out.
I mean, there's something, it seems to me, happening here that is not a question of lines and who gets what and sovereignty, and there's something else happening here.
I think China sees the world order today. It wants to cast that world order in its own mold, as it were. And today it has the power, it has the influence, it has the wealth to assert itself in a manner that was not possible in the period that I write about. Which was a very different China, as you know. And I think the quote you referred to from Sir Girja Shankar Bajpai about, this question of countries competing with each other and not existing in a state of peaceful coexistence, but more in a state of competitive coexistence, I think is what is happening between India and China. As India is growing in size and becoming more resource capable, becoming more able to assert its presence on the global stage, the economy growing, it has stayed a democracy. It offers an alternative to China in Asia, I think, which is very powerful, which is very credible in many ways for the region. Nobody doubts the credibility of India's capacity to grow and to become powerful and to become a leading global power. I don't think anybody doubts it. One has to, of course, calculate how much time it's going to take, but we seem to be set on the right course. And I think China, in many ways, would like to curb that, would like to somehow limit the scope of India's rise, and thereby you see China's hyperactivity in our region, the ties it has developed with Pakistan, of course, which grew essentially out of the problems with India, as my book tells you. But Pakistan was able to provide many advantages to China, including the opening to the United States, as you know, in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. So China is active in our neighborhood. China is active in the Indian Ocean. China is
China's active everywhere.
Is active everywhere. There's all this, this talk of reform of the United Nations Security Council, for instance, and the question of India's membership. The leading voice against that is China's. So it's this competition that has now emerged between India and China, and I think India has every right to seek to compete with China and to aspire to be at that level where it can be a serious contender for a front place on the global stage with China. And I think China is not prepared for that. China, of course, is now looking at the United States, how it will manage that relationship in order to be able to overtake the United States, or at least to define the world order through its own conceptualization of what the world should look like and what should be the rules of an international order with Chinese characteristics.
Andy?
So a two-part question. What you say makes a lot of sense, but it implies that had you been the ambassador in the 1950s and Nehru had taken your advice to negotiate the border and it had been settled, things today would still be just as bad as they are anyway. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying it would have been. I'm not saying it would have been settled if I had been ambassador.
Oh.
What I wanted to say, perhaps I didn't explain it sufficiently, was that we would have understood the Chinese better. We would have been able to open all these questions at that initial stage.
And then you would have.
And to understand why it was necessary for us to keep the issue of Tibet open, not to concede everything to the Tibetans before settling the border. Keeping these things open, which would have meant that we would have had a very difficult relationship with China, even from the beginning.
Things would have been even worse.
Could have been extremely complicated, but we would have been better prepared, I think, for all that.
So had you been prepared then?
And our relationship with countries like the United States and the Western countries perhaps would have been much closer than they were at that time.
You make it quick, Andy, because we want to get some questions from the audience.
Then we can go.
No, go ahead.
Well, so then, so I did misunderstand you, and I thought you were going to settle the border and things would have been okay, and then I was surprised when you.
No, I'm not saying it couldn't have been settled, but I mean, you're not really, because Zhou Enlai was very elliptical about some things he's had to say on where the border should be.
But if you didn't give up in '54 on the autonomy of Tibet, you'd still have the autonomy. You have the Dalai Lama now as an instrument against China, but you'd have even more than that. You'd have what we have in Taiwan, sort of the status of Tibet is unsettled. You'd have that to hold over the heads of the.
Well, the world. I think the whole attitude of the international attitude on Tibet would have also been different.
So Orville wants me to hurry, so therefore I have to just ask you whether you're saying that India should be more confrontational with China than it is as of now.
I think the current situation in our relations with China, if you'd asked me to describe the state of health of that relationship, I'd say it's very poor, very poor. There is a complete absence of trust between the two countries. There is no leadership level understanding. Mr. Narendra Modi, our Prime Minister, and President Xi Jinping of China have not really had a face-to-face meeting since these clashes happened. And India has sought to disentangle itself from China in terms of the economic relationship. It's not been easy to do so, but certain processes are certainly underway. We've come much closer to groupings like the Quad. We are less hesitant about stating our position on, the nature of politics in the Indo-Pacific. And the confrontation with China continues. You may argue that we are meeting the Chinese and the Russians at the SCO, and we have the Russia-India-China grouping, and we've been rather circumspect about what has happened in Ukraine, because we still have a close defense relationship with Russia. But the fact is that India, we live in a season of fundamental change, I believe, as far as the geopolitics of our region are concerned. And Indian foreign policy and Indian attitudes to many of these countries are also evolving. And I see a trend in our foreign policy relationships that will bring us closer and closer to the United States and to Japan, to Australia, to South Korea, to the Western democracies than ever before. And a gradual decoupling, if you can call it that, I would say a disentanglement from old relationships, like the one we have with Russia. With the Chinese, I think I don't see much light on the horizon, because the border dispute is so intractable, and you have China that is extremely assertive. You have a leader in China who says not an inch of territory should be given up, that we have to somehow undo all the harms done to China in the past. So given that kind of attitude from a big power like China and, a superpower like China, I think countries like India have to prepare for a difficult time ahead as far as that relationship is concerned.
As you write, India and China are essentially competitors and rivals in Asia as they jockey for position of influence in both continental and maritime Asia.
Yes, exactly.
There's so many questions, we could go on forever, but you all may have some. Yes, right here. There's a microphone just coming up.
I actually had a question on security.
Why don't you just tell us who you are?
Sure, I'm sorry. My name is Donald Camp. I'm a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer. Worked on both China and India back in the day. I was struck by your reference to, offhanded reference to Arunachal Pradesh as potentially another Taiwan. And I'd hate to challenge two such eminent China experts, but I really think that's unrealistic, because it's my assumption, and I'd like to hear from Ambassador Rao on this, that the reason that China has maintained its claim on Arunachal Pradesh all these years is because they see a very logical trade with Indian demands that Aksai Chin be returned. And am I correct that Aksai Chin is far more important strategically to China than it is to India? The road between Tibet and Xinjiang goes through there, whereas Arunachal Pradesh is a very well-established state of India. So I haven't read your book, so I don't know your views on this, but I'm curious about why that isn't a logical, and why that isn't a potential easy territorial agreement.
Which one are they going to give away?
India gives away Aksai Chin, which they haven't occupied for 70 years, 60 years, and India retains Arunachal Pradesh, which is that.
Well, first and foremost, I don't know if that's a realistic assumption today. It was something you could have batted on, to use a cricket term, in 1960, perhaps, when Zhou Enlai came to India before the war and made some kind of, as I said, very elliptical offers about what a settlement could look like. But I said since the mid-80s, the Chinese have spoken about the eastern sector as the sector of largest dispute. And if you read some of the writings particularly from retired PLA officers and all, about the war with China, with India in 1962, they still haven't come to terms with the fact that their leadership in Beijing, in Chungnanhai, and that Chairman Mao particularly, had ordered the withdrawal of PLA troops from the areas they occupied in Arunachal Pradesh to the north of the border. They still haven't come to terms, and there are lines in many of these writings say that China may have won the battle, but it lost the war. So you see, so that territory is obviously, it's resource rich, it has water, it has forests, it has settled populations, and China is covetous of territory like that, especially when it comes to Tibet. And you know the harshness of life in Tibet and the paucity of resources that can maintain settled life. And that's why you haven't had too much Chinese settlement in Tibet, although they have set up these border villages, so-called border villages now, you read about them. But how are these going to be sustained? It's only by perhaps trading with the other side or building communications. And building communications and opening up these borderlands to traditional activity is not something I personally have a quarrel with, because that helps the people in the border areas. But where China is concerned, where you want to move lines of sovereignty and where you want to seek the so-called return of these territories, that's where I think everything gets stuck, as it were, because you can't expect India to make concessions, so-called concessions of that sort. So this question of Taiwan and relating it to Taiwan, it's like, in the case of Taiwan, China is seeking a so-called reunification of these two, it's as if China had been partitioned in some way and it has to seek a revocation of that. But in the case of Arunachal Pradesh, it's a little different, of course. China has not raised it in that context. It hasn't said it wants to reunify this territory with Tibet. It's not saying that. But they keep persisting with the claim, for instance, on the town of Tawang, which is really the jewel in the crown in many ways. It is the most religiously, spiritually, historically, it's a very important part of this territory south of the McMahon Line. And the Chinese covet that particularly. And it's impossible. I don't see any Indian government conceding.
Are they afraid that the successor Dalai Lama will be discovered there?
The Chinese are afraid of so many things.
Yeah. Any other question? Yes.
I would just like to...
Just wait for the microphone for a second. Yeah.
I'm Carol Hamilton. I'm the U.S. public diplomat at the UN General Assembly. And I would like to take issue with what you just said about the population, because in fact, there has been tremendous population transfer, if I understood you correctly, of Chinese into Tibet over the last many years. Tremendous amount of population transfer, which has been part of their strategy, actually, and I hate to say it, but really destroying the culture. And they've been very successful. And in fact, it's quite sad. And I think, if I understood you correctly, earlier you were referring to an agreement. I think you might have been referring to the 19-point agreement. Were you
17.
referring to that?
The 17-point agreement?
Oh, is it 17? I was thinking it was 19. My father-in-law was part of that delegation with the Dalai Lama, and sadly, they had no choice, really, but to sign that agreement. But unfortunately,
Your father-in-law was Tibetan?
My father-in-law was Tibetan,
okay.
And he was part of the whole delegation with the Dalai Lama to go to try to negotiate with the
Yes,
Chinese.
the Dalai Lama was in Yatung, and they went back to Lhasa.
Pardon?
He was in Yatung, in the Chumbi Valley.
Yeah.
He had sought kind of refuge there when the Chinese entered Lhasa. And he was awaiting signals from India whether it could offer refuge to him, the young Dalai Lama. And then when things didn't work out, he finally returned to Lhasa and the agreement was signed.
Well, they actually signed, maybe I'm mistaken, because I know they went to China. Well,
there was a delegation that went
Yeah.
to China, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
But the Dalai Lama endorsed the agreement ultimately.
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, but they had no choice. And,
Yeah.
And actually, they were in agreement with self-determination because they had no choice. But had the Chinese abided by it, then maybe we would have a slightly different situation. Hard to know. But thank you very much. This has been fascinating.
Thank you. I think you're about populations. I was referring more to settlements, permanent settlements. Chinese are obviously coming in. Civilian Chinese are coming in to Lhasa, transacting business, setting up, promoting their interests, I suppose, there. But in terms of, whole families kind of coming to Tibet, unlike what has happened in Xinjiang, for instance, where the composition of the population, as you know, has changed in terms of how many Han Chinese live in Xinjiang today. So the population, yes, I know the Atlas of Tibet, which was published, Historical Atlas of Tibet, published a few years ago, did refer to these figures and how these had been going up steadily. And these border villages that I referred to, that the Chinese are setting up in areas contiguous to the border with India, which are less arid, especially in the east, which have more forests and water and things. They are trying to bring people in, but what are those people going to do if there's an unsettled border? They can't transact business across the border. They can't do all the traditional things that border peoples did. And that is really the loss, the tragedy of what has happened in the Himalayan borderlands because of the dispute between India and China. All those traditional activities have been destroyed.
I mean, I think that there's a larger question here of why are these issues so important to China that they risk alienating whole countries and peoples for the question of sovereign territory that may be not so consequential. But let's have. Peter, did you have a question? Yeah, let's make this the last question because Andy's got to catch a train here in
New Jersey.
Peter Bernstein, I'm a literary agent, some of you know. This is a wildly hypothetical question, but do you think that China's policies would be different in all of the things that we've been discussing if the Communist Party was not in charge of China?
I really can't answer that question in the affirmative. Because part of my book refers to the attitude of the Kuomintang Chinese, where India was concerned also, and Chiang Kai-shek's China at that time. And especially in the United Nations, I refer to certain dispatches sent by Indian representatives about how the Chinese, the nationalist Chinese, were reacting, for instance, to Nehru's visit to the United States in 1949 when he was invited by the Truman administration. And the nationalist Chinese who were, Beijing had not yet fallen at that time, they were very unhappy about this, the fact that India was being courted by the Americans and that India could emerge as a potential rival. Not that that was exactly happening at that time, but the attitude that China had to be the leading Asian power and not India. I think the nationalists also nurtured that ambition and that attitude. And it was seen even in Chiang Kai-shek's advice to Churchill and others to negotiate with Gandhi and Nehru. The British summed it all up at that time as saying that, Chiang Kai-shek and others did not want the situation in India, the problems the British had with India, the freedom struggle that the Indians were waging, to stand in the way of any prospect or potential for China at the end of the war to really emerge as number one.
And I think it's worth pointing out that the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek also claimed Tibet.
Yes.
Also claimed Mongolia, Xinjiang, Manchuria, and Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and Macau.
So there's really...
So they were on the same page
exactly.
In terms of that. All right, listen, this is a really interesting exploration into a bit of history, which I think is very telling in certain ways about the future, and I must say, doesn't leave me in a very optimistic frame of mind about the ability to come to terms with China on almost anything. but that's just my view. So, Nirupama, thank you. It's a wonderful book. We have some copies outside for sale, and Nirupama would be glad to sign them. And Andy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.